kind of shifting, you know, different fields to kind of like the academic setting, right? Where do you think that human service programs or social justice focused, you know, undergraduate programs, where can just academia in general make space for this perspective, this more humanized perspective that critical psychology kind of offers? Because there's if there was space for it in programs like that I went through, other students go through, you know, it would eventually make what you do obsolete, right? Like, how do we introduce this in the earlier stages of creating professionals that don't get lost and jumbled up when they realize like they don't understand what the big picture is compared to those that they serve at an individual level.
Yeah, well, first I want to say I hope that critical psychology becomes obsolete. Personally, I hope that this perspective gets so infused with psychology that it loses its separate identity. That would be great. I think, I think every academic discipline probably has to decide how it's, if it's going to incorporate critical theory, how it's going to do that. But we do a lot of that at the undergrad level. When we teach intro, it's from a critical perspective. So we teach the basics of intro to psych. This is the founding fathers of psychology, and here's, cognitive psych, behavioral psych, and all of that. And we also look at the critical perspectives. Who was creating this research? Who was it serving? Who was being harmed by this research? What kind of societal ideals do you see? Do you see racism and sexism and classism present in these theories and in this and in the research that supported those? And there's lots of examples throughout the history of psych
Right.
in intro, yeah, where that's so I think there's ways to start integrating critical theory and critical perspectives in just about everything. I have a colleague here at Prescott College that she's a critical historian, so she teaches lots of history about lots of different things, but from a critical perspective. So again, asking, whose voices are present in these narratives. So for instance, she does this great tour here on campus with some of our incoming students, undergrad students, where we do a tour of Prescott and we go to the museum and we go downtown to the square where there's all these kinds of plaques and we learn about the history of Prescott. And then we say, whose voices aren't present here? Those voices are primarily the indigenous voices of the people who lived here before the colonizers came. They're the voices of the Asian immigrants who came to work here. There was a large Chinese population. You never hear about them, and how they were essentially discarded when they were no longer needed for work here. And so whose voices are present, which stories are being told, which stories aren't being told, what it's supporting. And I think you can do that in a lot of different fields. Is that answering your question? I mean,
No, yeah, absolutely. Yeah. It gets to one of my favorite practices, and I don't know, this will be like episode 10 or 9 or whatever. And I'm saying it again, this integration of not only other professionals, but other ideas. Like, you have the history that kind of like, here's the point, here's where we saw that there was a mistake. Let's integrate this into what we're approaching now. And it cannot be avoided. Now, again, we don't have a reference point to where we've ever integrated anything perfectly, because every time someone's tried in human history, somebody got killed or a country was, defeated, or, it's just no one likes mixing. But we're at a point, especially in human services, you cannot walk out into that field without understanding that there is something from somewhere else, whether it be history or social justice, or, even, I dare say, understanding certain pseudosciences, because people do love that when they're in a state of crisis, or, if there's mass distrust, and bringing that into understanding, okay, what am I doing to serve, and how does that apply?
Yeah, I love that. I love the integration that you're talking about. And also I think within critical perspectives, there's an acknowledgement that that it's not like we're discovering truths and then we're done. So like now the field is set, right? So,
Right.
I think it's called like progressivism or something. There's a way of understanding history where the view is that wherever you are is better than what came before, that we now have more knowledge or better knowledge than we did before.
I've heard that brought up a lot in just various academics, and they're usually white Western men, where there's this progressive idea like, well, let's focus on the we're doing better than we used to. It's like, good, you're right.
Well, and sometimes that's true, but sometimes we don't, sometimes it's hard to tell until, we get some historical perspective. And
Right,
so, I think one of the dangers, I mean, we're seeing this even in the hard sciences, but also in the social sciences, is like what happens when we reify our ideas and say, okay, now this is truth. And everything that comes next has to be based on this. And I think within critical perspectives, it's like we are always emerging. And so we are willing to let go of what we see right now of how we understand things to be, to make room for new understandings that will come in the future. And so we're not trying to like figure out the truth about the best way to do psychology for all time, for people 100 years from now. And so I think when
right.
we learn about the history of the field, we can say, well, yeah, sure, this is how behaviorism came into being. What can it do for us now? How can we change it? Should we continue with it? Should we put it down and create something else? And to remember that everything we're doing now also needs to stay nimble for future generations to be able to pick up and do something different with. I think that psychology is moving in a direction um, of being comfortable going beyond hard science to back up its claims. But if you go back further historically in psychology, psychology really emerged from philosophy. And, for all, as far as we know, all of human history, humans have been trying to figure out how to live a good life, how to have more happiness and less suffering. And it was really philosophers that were doing that work. And then at some point, psychology emerged. Psychology really started to separate from philosophy during kind of the scientific revolution, when we thought that science was the way that we could really get, hard facts about something, not be so biased, which did a lot of great things. But psychology for a while after that had this need to prove itself as a science, which is where we get
True. Yeah.
behaviorism, these other things, right? And it really rejected um, philosophy and wisdom traditions and spiritual traditions and soul and art and creativity and experience in favor of things that could be, experimented and turned into numbers and reproduced. Although, as we know now, that whole thing is we have the replication crisis, so it didn't really work very well, right? And so I think now, a lot of philosophy and theory and wisdom and soul is coming back into psychology, which I'm really happy to see.
You mentioned so many different influences, especially going back to what you mentioned earlier, the philosophy behind psychology, right? Um, Talk about how that is integrated in not just the way you teach it, but the way that critical psychology is developed, like the philosophy behind critical psychology.
Well, so first I should say that I come from, like, my own personal brand of critical psychology is influenced by um, existential and phenomenological psychology, transpersonal psychology, Buddhism, Buddhist psychology, wisdom traditions in general. And I think that um, that's not always a common integration. So that's kind of, I went to school at the University of West Georgia. That's a special blend they do there that I find really beautiful. But the critical psychology itself really comes out of critical social theory and the Frankfurt School of social thought. I think that existential and existential philosophy and wisdom traditions blend really well with critical psychology, which I talked about in the paper that you're referring to, the chapter that you're referring to, because I think that sometimes from the critical perspectives, we do overemphasize the macro and underemphasize the micro. So overemphasizing society and systems, underemphasizing the role of the individual.
I'll ask one more question. We'll kind of end on this. And I'm definitely having you back because there's so much more we're going to talk about, especially in helping students and people in practice kind of find their way to critical psych if that's what they're interested in. So what do you see as kind of like the next, evolutionary step for critical psychology? What kind of comes next in this whole academic development, just perspective development, just where, especially in your shoes and in the position you hold, like what's the end goal here? Is that, if there is one, if there doesn't have to be.
I mean, in some ways, I go back to what I said earlier that that I think I would love to see critical psychology outgrow itself and become not a separate field anymore, that critical perspectives would just be blended holistically into all of the different psychological projects that we do, so that we're doing them in a more holistic, informed way that includes the micro and the macro, includes the individual and society, that fully recognizes those relationships, that's constantly being mindful about issues of power and privilege and oppression, and how we're working within those systems, so that all of the work that we do is coming from that perspective. I guess on the shorter scale, I would like to see critical psychology become more known. It's still an emerging field, and so I think a lot of people are really seeking and looking for these critical perspectives. They don't know that they're out there, but they're feeling their presence, they're feeling their necessity. And so on the short term, having more people connect, more people become familiar with the terms and the theories, and find new creative ways to integrate it into whatever work they're doing, whether it's in psychology or human services or hard sciences or engineering. I think that there's places for critical theory. Yeah, and then in the long term, I would like to see it just be diffused into all of these fields, so that we're doing them from a more responsible place.
I think that human services is probably the best shoot off point that you could have possibly started at. And I'm excited because, we are here to talk about human services, but I think this field is the perfect stage for introducing just the possibilities of what critical psychology can provide, either in theory or practice, or, ideally both. And then that integration, I love it so much. Okay, we're gonna end there before I burn out my battery. um,
Hey,
Thank you so much. I'm gonna get more information from you as far as how students can find your program, and I will share that.
okay.
Thank y'all so much for tuning in. This has been an amazing conversation. We're gonna have more of these, obviously. We will see you there. Thanks. For more information about the programs at Prescott College, you can check out their website linked below. Thanks again for tuning in, and if you'd like to continue supporting our podcast, you can check out our landing page for other episodes, and then like and comment and share. NationalHumanServices.org is our website, and that's where you'll find more information on becoming a member and tons of other resources all related to the human services.